in schools of different year groups as people tested positive for the virus and whole groups had to isolate. There were a number of calls because schools became more and more the kind of hotbed of transmission for the virus here. So there were calls for schools to online learning. So I've got some of my class in school. We're still providing face-to-face learning for the children of key workers so that they can be in the health service, in the emergency services, helping keep the country going, and also for our most vulnerable children face-to-face. And then we're also providing online learning for students who don't fall into those categories, who are learning from home. It's been a learning curve, I'll say that.
Yes. And with the online learning, what do you find that you miss most?
So I think one of the difficulties is teaching, learning, education is a process that's really built on relationships. So I know when I'm in a classroom, when I'm working with students, it's very interactive. It's a discussion, and I'm leading and directing that discussion. That's much harder online. It misses that interaction, the real sort of core of the education. However, there are lots of creative approaches people have been able to adapt, and we're exploring that more and more now. For example, setting tasks which don't involve sitting on the screen the entire time staring at the teacher, but which involve investigations based in the real world at home. So the challenge might be, to go on and find something, to look at a number of different factors, investigate, try and solve a problem in detail and come back. Because obviously we're concerned about the amount of time students are spending on the screen. We're providing, I think the government guidance is between 3 to 5 hours of learning per day for the home learning. And I'll be honest, I'd be really concerned if my children were staring at a screen for 3 to 5 hours a day.
Of course, there are those who are genuinely concerned that the children who haven't been able to go to school in England, in the United Kingdom, for periods of the last year, will have been damaged in the long term by that experience. Do you share that view, that fear?
It's definitely different. I'd hesitate to use the term damaged. We know that it can be really difficult, and it depends on every individual circumstance, and that's why schools have continued to provide face-to-face learning for the most vulnerable students who we feel that there may be harm from them not having access to school. I think it has its challenges, but I also think as educators, we should be seeking the opportunities there. What can we do differently in this context that will be even better for our students rather than put them at a disadvantage?
Experiences from Kenya and from Britain via Divinar Joseph and Gawain Little. We're listening to those experiences. Professor Dr. Jörg Fegert, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist, psychotherapist and professor at Ulm University in Germany. Welcome, Professor. Good morning.
Good morning.
I know you've been doing some work looking at children's mental health in Germany and the impact that lockdown has had on them. What have you found?
We have found very similar results, and in general, we see a renaissance of the household, and it really depends on the functioning of the core family. And we had a representative survey ongoing during the first lockdown, and we haven't seen any large differences with respect to stress for the whole sample. But if we go to subsamples of families that had experienced stress before, that had stressful life events, that suffer from depression, anxiety, have people with substance abuse in the family, we have a completely different picture. Therefore, I completely agree with your guess that it really depends on how the family is coping with the situation. Our highest concern is domestic violence and child abuse in these situations. I'm also running the German Medical Child Protection Hotline, providing consultation for health professionals in cases of suspected child abuse. And we had a decrease of reports because people didn't attend schools, didn't go to doctors, in the first lockdown and see the same phenomenon again with the next lockdown.
What you seem to be saying is that if a household was troubled prior to lockdown, those troubles have been exacerbated by lockdown.
Yes,
Is that fair?
that's fair, because they are relying on support from the
Yeah.
society or from grandparents, and we had a enormous decrease of contact with grandparents, and that's the usual support families get.
Let me bring my guests in who are listening to you, and I'll come back to you after that. Miriam, Francois, what's your experience been here, and I wonder what points you wanted to pick up on the basis of what you've heard.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a single parent myself. I have a 7-year-old child. I'm also a freelancer in what is a precarious industry at the best of times, and so I think there's a lot of what I'm hearing from everyone really that resonates. For a start, I mean, the idea that any of us who are at home having to teach our children for extended periods of time can simultaneously perform a full-time job is obviously mythical. It's incredibly difficult to teach your children and stay on top of tasks. And in my case, I would say as a freelancer, and I'm sure this is true for many freelancers, I would say you're working at least twice or 3 times as hard for, perhaps half the results. So there's a lot of impact in terms of trying to juggle those things. But I mean, I have long-term concerns about what I'm seeing in my child's classroom. I'm seeing a large gap being created between the children who really have very little support at home, often because parents might be working, or the sole provider of the household is on the computer, the only computer in the household, and the children are then trying to work either on phones or not at all. In some cases, there were children during the last lockdown at my son's school who weren't able to do any work for several months.
Just on that, I mean, there's been an interesting announcement, hasn't there, by the UK government on that children should be regarded as vulnerable, which would mean that they'd still be entitled to go into school despite their wider closures if they haven't got that kind of computer access.
Yeah, and I suppose that's also a question for parents who will then have to determine whether their children would be considered vulnerable enough to be sent into schools, which, I think there is still a lot of parents who do have concerns around transmission within a schooling environment. If you are, like, many parents in this country, the sole provider, the risk of you then falling ill whilst caring for children, including one of my friends caring for a child with special needs, whilst working full-time and homeschooling 2 children. I mean, we also need to think about the long-term consequences of these children having no socialization, very little books to read, if any, in some cases, issues to do with concentration, children who won't have had to sit down and focus on a task for any amount of time for months on end, obesity because children aren't moving, and screen time. If you don't want your child constantly moving from a computer to a television to a computer to a television, you are having to find very concrete activities. And I would salute anyone who's able to find the time to do that whilst working full time. It's extremely difficult.
Let me bring Sebastian in with a brief thought, if you would, Sebastian.
Well, it's very similar, the picture in Germany, of course, for parents trying to work around a job and their kids' educations, and very the effect on children in troubled families is absolutely awful. There's no doubt about it.
And Professor, a final brief thought, if you would, from you. What do you want government to learn from your study?
Because I think we have to avoid the increase of that gap that your guests mentioned between the high-risk children. And I think if you talk about vulnerable children or children of key workers, there's also some sort of stigmatization, and we need solutions that fit for a whole group. And I think governments have to see that also within the medical field, we have to have a focus not only on virology and epidemiology, but we need strong support for mental health and education.
Okay. Very grateful to you. Thank you very much for coming on, Professor Dr. Jörg Fegert. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service. Now, since Beijing imposed a stringent security law on Hong Kong in June last year, the territory's prominent pro-democracy activists knew they could, at pretty much any moment, be taken off the streets. On Wednesday, 53 of them were arrested, accused of trying to overthrow the government of Hong Kong. They're not the first to be arrested under the security law, which allows those convicted of sedition to be jailed for life, and very likely they'll not be the last. As Hong Kong-based writer Anthony Daparan explains in this essay that he recorded for Weekend, the city, in the course of the past 6 months since the law came into force, has changed for good.
On a stifling Sunday afternoon in Hong Kong last July, I walked down the hill from my apartment to the small public square outside my local district councillor's office. I joined a socially distanced queue, face mask on, and cast my vote in primary runoff elections organised by the city's pro-democracy political parties. The purpose of the primary was to select pro-democracy candidates who would then contest 35 democratically elected seats in the city's legislature in elections due to be held that September. Alongside my neighbours, I verified my identity and residential address with the volunteer scrutineers, was given a code to access the voting platform on my phone, and made my selection. As I did so, there was a lump in my throat. Despite everything, the months of protests that had riven the city in 2019, the ensuing government crackdown, the pandemic that had led to so much disruption and uncertainty, this was an act of hope, a shared hope. We allowed ourselves a smile underneath our face masks. The vote was taking place just a few weeks after Beijing had imposed a new national security law on the city that aimed to stifle dissent to China's rule. Hong Kong had suddenly become a place where one could be arrested for chanting slogans like 5 demands, not one less, or waving banners reading Liberate Hong Kong. Then, the government warned that the Democrats' planned primary election was itself an act of subversion, and anyone participating may be committing a crime under the new law. But voters came out anyway. In a year in which no public protests had been permitted due to the pandemic, the primary vote became a virtual mass protest. The full elections scheduled for September were ultimately called off, postponed for at least a year due to the pandemic, said the authorities. Then, this past week, some 6 months after we voted on that July weekend, the authorities have undertaken the largest mass arrests yet under the national security law. Officials said that the arrests targeted only the active players in this subversive plot, not those who merely voted in the election. Was this supposed to make me and my fellow voters feel relieved? Or perhaps grateful at being spared? Most of us just feel numb. We never would have imagined that it would come to this. The hope we all shared that summer weekend is gone for now. There's no sign of new elections. Protests continue to be banned. For now, in Hong Kong, China's hand of vengeance is more frightening and unpredictable than the deadly coronavirus. So, forgive us if we can no longer smile and hope behind our masks.
Anthony Daparan, a Hong Kong-based writer and lawyer, and the author of the book City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong. Sebastian Borger, how do you judge the reaction internationally to events in Hong Kong?
Well, there's hardly any, is there? I mean, the Foreign Office here in London put out its usual statement decrying all these events in Hong Kong over the last half year or so to no effect whatsoever. I haven't seen anything really very strong from the EU. Of course, we're all very much focused on events in the US, aren't we? And I think that's a general problem, that the United States are much easier to understand, not least the language.
The UK, of course, has at least made the offer to people in Hong Kong that they can come to the UK if they feel affected by that new law, haven't they?
They're very good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. And also the offer to get passports last year, all very well. But we're not engaging really with the pretty tough way of China suppressing all dissent in Hong Kong and, of course, around their country.
Illustrated perhaps by the comprehensive agreement on investment between China and the EU, signed only at the end of 2020.
Absolutely the wrong time as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I think 2021 should be about repairing the transatlantic relationship and be very, very cautious of what China is about. I thought the way Australia was bullied by Beijing last year basically went down in Europe, particularly without almost any noticing of that. I think people are too focused on the bottom line and not at all focused on human rights.
Miriam Francois, what's your take on it?
Well, I mean, this is the new front line of the updated Cold War, and clearly China is a force that nobody wishes to confront, whether it be in Hong Kong, where we're seeing it particularly starkly because the clash of, I guess, worldviews is particularly prominent, but it's also, a country which is running the largest mass internment of an ethnic religious minority since the World War. It's a country which we have now growing evidence that these camps are being used to create mass sterilization of women, forced slavery, and yet...
You're referring to the Uyghurs there, I'm assuming.
I am absolutely referring to the Uyghur minority, the Uyghur Muslim minority in China. And so I guess the question is, if we're quite happy to sign trade deals with China, presumably there are no longer calls for there to be any countries off limits. Iran presumably will be next to be completely rehabilitated. I think at a certain point, and particularly where we stand now, countries need to be very clear on what messages that we're putting up in terms of what values we stand for. We cannot assume that everyone shares our worldview, and China is displaying superpower ambitions, has been for a while. And the question is, do we want to support the growth of that ambition and what China stands for? Or do we perhaps need to be taking a stronger stance in the knowledge that the new technologies that they are often very much at the forefront of are the new front line of these wars? It's not about bombs and it's not about soldiers. It's about who controls technologies and flows of finance. And this is a country which has shown itself to be particularly strong and adept in this field. And I personally think that we need to be in Europe taking a much stronger stance.
Okay. My guests today, Sebastian Borger and Miriam Francois. You'll hear plenty more from them in the next hour and a half of the programme. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service, and the latest news is next.
This is the BBC World Service. Now here's something to think about.
I'm David Edmonds, and in The Big Idea, I'll be examining new research on human reason and rationality.
Cultures that have been more integrated into market trading, they show a stronger concern for fairness.
I found some of the most fascinating ideas around and the people who thought them up.
The Big Idea, Sunday at 14 GMT. And at bbcworldservice.com, Crowd Science with Anand Jagatia.
Can green spaces make us healthier? For many of us, being outdoors in nature is relaxing, but are the plants themselves impacting our health? And if so, how?
Now it's back to Weekend. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 7 hours GMT. Welcome to Weekend with Julia Morica. Coming up, Twitter permanently suspends the online account of Donald Trump. We'll look back at what he and his supporters did this week.
Take that house! Take it now! Take it now!
have we now entered a new American era?
The founding fathers had the optimistic 18th century notion that a political idea expressed in the Constitution could actually triumph over raw power.
Also in the programme.
We've all tried to squeeze out of her whether she really, truly will leave office.
The race to pick the successor of Angela Merkel as Germany's next Chancellor. That's all here on Weekend After the World News.
This is the BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. President Donald Trump has accused Twitter of conspiring with the Democrats and the radical left after the company shut down his personal online account. Twitter said there were concerns about further incitements to violence by Mr. Trump after Wednesday's assault on the US Capitol building by his supporters. Here's our North America correspondent David Willis.
Twitter has enabled him to both build and to rally his base, and it will no longer be available to him. Twitter citing what it called the risk of further incitement of violence for its decision. And, of course, President Trump once famously said that without Twitter, he wouldn't be here, and he's also boasted of being the Hemingway of 140 characters.
Google has suspended Parler, an online social app popular with US conservatives, saying it had not sufficiently removed posts inciting violence and hate. Apple has also told the owners of Parler it's deleting the app from its online store because it refused to moderate its content. The platform has several high-profile contributors, including the Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who has nearly 5 million followers. Democratic Party members of Congress have revealed the draft of a new impeachment resolution against President Trump. It accuses him of inciting an insurrection and of endangering the security of the United States and its institutions. In an interview with CBS News' 60 Minutes programme, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said Mr. Trump needed to be removed from office.
Sadly, the person who's running the executive branch is a deranged, unhinged, dangerous president of the United States. And only a number of days until we can be protected from him. But he has done something so serious that there should be prosecution against him.
The House of Representatives is expected to vote on the impeachment motion next week, but reports in the US media suggest it's not expected to reach the Senate until after Mr. Trump has left office. A second round of peace negotiations between Taliban and Afghan government officials is due to resume later in the Gulf state of Qatar. The two sides will discuss how they'll try to bridge their division over how they believe the country should be run. The talks have been overshadowed by ongoing violence in Afghanistan. Here's Sikandar Kamani.
Last month, they finally agreed upon the rules governing the talks. Now they'll be turning to the agenda for the negotiations, and that will bring them to the very different priorities the two sides have. The Afghan government want to see a ceasefire declared as soon as possible. The Taliban say that will have to wait until a power-sharing arrangement has been reached, establishing what they term as a new Islamic government.
World News from the BBC. A study of coronavirus patients in the Chinese city of Wuhan, where the outbreak began, has found that more than three-quarters still have at least one ongoing symptom 6 months later. Of more than 1,700 people who were admitted to hospital, researchers found more than 60% continued to experience fatigue and muscle weakness. The North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has described the United States as his country's biggest enemy and said he doesn't expect Washington to change its policy towards Pyongyang, whoever is president. Mr. Kim was addressing a rare congress of the ruling Korean Workers' Party. From Seoul, here's Laura Bicker.
Kim Jong-un's speech to the party congress described plans to develop the country's nuclear arsenal. He outlined a list of desired weapons, including long-range ballistic missiles capable of being launched from land or sea. Mr. Kim added that he did not intend to use nuclear weapons unless hostile forces plan to use them first. North Korea has managed to significantly advance its arsenal despite being subject to strict economic sanctions. Mr. Kim's 3 summits with Donald Trump have also failed to lead to any significant deal. These remarks are likely aimed at applying pressure on President-elect Joe Biden.
A fire at a government hospital in the Indian state of Maharashtra has killed 10 babies. The infants, aged between a few days and 3 months, were being cared for at a neonatal unit when the fire broke out in the early hours of the morning. The cause of the fire is yet to be determined. The world's oldest living Olympic champion is celebrating her 100th birthday today. Agnes Keleti, a Hungarian gymnast, survived the Second World War and the Holocaust before winning 10 medals, including 5 golds in the Helsinki and Melbourne Games in the 1950s. By that time, she was already more than 30 years old. BBC News.
and condemnation around the world, but what do historians make of it all? I've been talking to British historian Simon Sharma.
It's really totally unprecedented. In essence, a president of the United States had just attacked the United States, because the United States is essentially a kind of an idea, and the founding fathers had the optimistic 18th century notion that a political idea expressed in the Constitution could actually triumph over raw power and naked, adventurous self-interest, and that's what was really directly under attack. There actually was one, I mean, this is a very small footnote for you, but Congress actually has been physically attacked before. It was the Confederated Congress of 1783, in other words, the Congress right after the American War of Independence had finished, sitting in Philadelphia, and it was attacked by 400 soldiers demanding back pay. And it was quite scary, actually. The officers of the Continental Congress asked the president of the Executive Council of Pennsylvania for help from militia, and John Dickinson, the president, said, "Sorry, you're out of luck. We're not interested in helping you. We're interested in doing our own thing in the state." And that was one of the reasons why Congress, after the Constitution was passed, was so keen to get out of Philadelphia and create a customized capital in Washington. But that is a sort of mildly comical historical anecdote. Basically, the dark side of what we were seeing on Wednesday has absolutely no precedent in the United States in its entire history.
In which case, as somebody who knows America as well as you do and who has lived there for a significant period of your life, how do you then reflect on the fact that if President Trump has done what he has done along the lines you have just described, that so recently 70 million Americans voted for him?
Maybe those 70 million Americans are not going to lose their belief. What we're seeing in the rise of populist nationalism is a huge number of people who are not that interested in the Constitution, not that interested in democracy. What they're interested in is a kind of cult of a leader whom they take to be the personification of what they call the real America. And that's a kind of essentially a white America. So the race element in all this was and remains extremely recalcitrant and really disturbing. There have been populist nationalist movements in America before. In fact, the word populism as a modern political term was coined in the United States at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. The difference, of course, as you'll know, is social media. Social media and the internet, which we all thought was going at one point, as did Tim Berners-Lee, thought was going to be a vehicle for truth and information and knowledge, has turned into a camping ground for the sealing off of tribal camps of delusion, if they want to be delusory. Otherwise, QAnon would not really have the appalling influence they do. There were people in that demonstration on Wednesday one was wearing a t-shirt which said Camp Auschwitz. There was another one wearing a shirt which said 6MWE, as in 6 million weren't enough. So, the most scary and astounding myths and lies and fables are available in this kind of poison world of social media, which we're struggling to get a hold of. The difference, I guess, between my life in America, when there were always neo-Nazis, George Lincoln Rockwell and so on, and fringe groups, is that fringe groups have never been encouraged by the chief executive of the United States before. That's the horrifying difference.
And what does this say to you about the system? And by that I mean the constant reference that you will hear to the checks and balances of the American system that in theory are there to give different levels of power to different groups and different individuals. The upshot of all that being that extremism will not eventually carry the day. I mean, that system has been tested, but has it just about passed that test?
Yes, I think it has. But I say that with a very cautionary and provisional sense of nervousness, really. Two things happened on Wednesday, didn't they? The first thing that happened, which was overwhelmed by what was going on outside and inside the Capitol was a triumphant Senate runoff election. I say triumphant not as someone on the side, which I am, of those who won, but in terms of the enormous turnout in that runoff election. And, that was a vindication of everything the Founding Fathers and the democratic system could possibly hope for. It was a shame that it took so long, but many of the most impassioned speeches expressing abhorrence of the invasion of the Capitol were made by Republicans like Mitch McConnell and the deeply decent Mitt Romney. So there are people across the board, who are prepared to stand up for the integrity of the representative democratic system. It's not flat on, it's not prostrate, but for the reasons I mentioned, the strength of social media, the possibility that an empire of lies can hold power for so long and double down on repeating the lies, like the millions of votes that were supposed to have been stolen, is extremely nerve-wracking. George Orwell, and indeed the great German essayist and political thinker Hannah Arendt, always warned that there was a crucial connection between sustaining freedom and a consensus on truth. And once that consensus really crumbles, freedom itself is in a very difficult and tricky position. And we'll see what happens during the next few years under the Biden administration in terms of exactly the important question you put, which is how much vitality and strength is left in what the Founding Fathers hoped would be the fortitude of the constitutional idea.
British historian Simon Sharma reflecting on the historical significance of the events in Washington of the last few days. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service. More in the last half hour of the programme from my guests Sebastian Borger and Miriam Francois. The latest news is next.
This is the BBC World Service, and on this week's assignment...
They were the family from hell, 7 murderous brothers who terrorised a Libyan town for most of the last decade. Now the evidence of their crimes is being unearthed. Join me, Tim Hewell, for assignment to find out how they got away with it.
Journeys to the heart of a story. Assignment at bbcworldservice.com/assignment. And in 30 minutes, when Catty met Carlos.
It's been a tumultuous few days in politics here in the United States.
Rioting on the streets, Congress under siege.
And yet there's still more than a week to go before a transfer of power.
Now it's back to Weekend. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 8 hours GMT. Welcome to Weekend with Julia Morica. Social media giant Twitter shuts down permanently the account of US President Trump due to the risk of further incitement of violence, they say. The tale of a conflict photographer who covered the Capitol riots.
Some of the photographs that I did inside the Capitol are interchangeable with images from Panama, from other conflicts and civil wars. The American people and the American government can no longer and should no longer think of themselves as being above everybody else. We are like everybody else.
We'll also get reaction from Europe on the latest developments in America. And Roaring Twenties, the return. 100 years later, will history repeat itself after the coronavirus pandemic? That's all here on Weekend after the latest world news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. Donald Trump has accused Twitter of conspiring with the Democrats and the radical left after the company shut down his personal online account. The outgoing president had nearly 90 million followers on the platform, which he used to address his supporters, often issuing threats or spreading false information. Here's our North America correspondent, David Willis.
Twitter has long been Donald Trump's preferred platform for picking fights, settling scores and promoting conspiracy theories. But company officials say they fear continued access could result in Mr. Trump stoking further violence in the run-up to Joe Biden's inauguration in 11 days' time. Taking to the official White House account to voice his displeasure, the president accused Twitter of suppressing free speech and said he was considering building a social media platform of his own, only for those tweets to also be removed.
Google has suspended Parler, an app popular with US conservatives, saying it hadn't done enough to remove posts inciting violence and hate. Apple has warned that it could follow suit. Parler's chief executive said he would not cave in to politically motivated companies and authoritarians who hated free speech. Democratic Party members of Congress have revealed the draft of a new impeachment resolution against President Trump. It accuses him of inciting an insurrection and of endangering the security of the United States and its institutions. In an interview with CBS News' 60 Minutes programme, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said Mr. Trump needed to be removed from office.
Sadly, the person who's running the executive branch is a deranged, unhinged, dangerous President of the United States, and only a number of days until we can be protected from him. But he has done something so serious that there should be prosecution against him.
The House of Representatives is expected to vote on the impeachment motion next week, but reports in the US media suggest it's not expected to reach the Senate until after Mr. Trump has left office. President-elect Joe Biden earlier said that Donald Trump had actively encouraged what he called a mob to enter the US Congress. As a result, 5 people had died, including a police officer. Referring to the Democrat plans to impeach the president, he said the best way to remove Mr. Trump from office was by making sure his own swearing-in took place on January the 20th. A study of coronavirus patients in the Chinese city of Wuhan, the epicenter of the pandemic, has found that more than 3/4 still have at least one ongoing symptom after 6 months. Researchers found over 60% of hospital patients continue to experience fatigue and muscle weakness half a year later. News from the BBC. A fire at a government hospital in the Indian state of Maharashtra has killed 10 babies. The infants, aged between a few days and 3 months, were being cared for at a neonatal unit in Bandara District General Hospital when the fire broke out in the early hours of the morning. Ambersan Etirajan reports from Delhi.
17 babies were in the special newborn care unit in the hospital in the western state of Maharashtra when the fire started. Staff rushed to rescue the babies, but only 7 could be saved. Reports said some were only a few days old, with the oldest only 3 months. Officials have ordered an investigation into the blaze, the cause of which is yet to be determined. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi described the incident as a heart-wrenching tragedy and said his thoughts were with the bereaved families.
A second round of peace negotiations between Taliban and Afghan government officials is due to resume later in the Gulf state of Qatar. The two sides are getting closer to discussing divisions over how the country should be run. The world's oldest living Olympic champion is celebrating her 100th birthday today. Agnes Keleti, a Hungarian gymnast, survived the Second World War and the Holocaust before winning 10 medals in the 1950s. Here's Nick Thorpe.
In a synagogue in central Budapest, a concert in honour of Agnes Keleti. At 16, she was Hungarian national champion, but the 1940 Olympics were cancelled by the Second World War.